Right now, this very moment, a plane is flying over the world that, by all logic, shouldn't exist. Built in 1955, 70 years ago, and still flying. But here's the thing. None of you know it's flying. Governments know, intelligence agencies know. You don't. Because what it sees, what it photographs, that's state secret. And it will remain one, probably, for another 100 years. This is a story about a machine that's impossible to replace. A story about prices people pay for knowledge they shouldn't possess. A story about why governments are willing to kill their own citizens for a single aerial photograph. And the main thing? This is a story they don't want you to hear. Today we reveal what's been hidden in the archives for 7 decades. What isn't written in history textbooks. What appears in intelligence reports in a single line buried between the stamp classified and the notation destroy. Watch to the end, and you'll understand why a machine created to win the Cold War still determines world foreign policy. In November 1954, the Central Intelligence Agency set before Johnson a task that sounded like mockery of common sense. The aircraft had to fly above 21 kilometers, photographed from this altitude, possess a range of no less than 5,000 kilometers without refueling. And all of this had to happen at speeds that seemed fantastic by the standards of the time. A standard aviation project took from 3 to 5 years. This was the norm, the sacred norm of industry. Committees, approvals, tests, modifications, more tests, more negotiations. Bureaucracy in its worst manifestation, but protection against disaster. Johnson looked at the technical specifications and said, 8 months. Those who heard him thought it was a figure of speech, a joke, mockery. But Johnson never joked. The contract with the CIA was signed November 22, 1954. The prototype's first flight occurred August 1st, 1955. 8 months and 10 days elapsed. It was impossible, and it happened. For perspective, today, certification of a single aircraft seat in the United States takes more than a year. Johnson, in that same time frame, constructed an airplane that literally altered the history of reconnaissance. The miracle happened because of where he worked. The division was called Skunk Works, roughly Skunk Factory. The name came from a popular comic where that's what the secret bootlegging operation was called. It was a workshop where the rules of common sense were suspended, where bureaucracy was synonymous with Project Death. The division operated in complete isolation from the rest of the corporation. No general meetings, no approval processes with headquarters, minimal reports, only the vital ones. Johnson had 14 personal rules for project management. 1. The number of reports should be minimal, but each report should be explosive in content. Another, the project manager must have complete control over all development aspects. By the standards of a major corporation in the 1950s, this sounded almost like heresy, like rejection of all management fundamentals. The budget for the first batch of 20 aircraft was $22,500,000. For that money in 1955, you couldn't even buy a single B-52 strategic bomber. Johnson knew how to accomplish the impossible for reasonable money. This was the third component of his genius. The aircraft received designation U-2. Official expansion, Utility Aircraft Number 2, meaning Utility Aircraft Number 2. Deliberately boring, deliberately faceless. No hint of espionage, no secrets. Just a utility machine, one of many. This was conscious deception, strategic camouflage. No one particularly believed it, but it provided formal cover, and that's all anyone needed. Now Johnson faced a problem that no one in aviation history had solved before. The aircraft had to fly where the air was so thin that ordinary engines began to stall, where a human without a special suit lost consciousness in seconds, where metal structures had to endure extreme temperature swings, from plus 50 degrees Celsius on the ground during acceleration to minus 65 at cruising altitude. He took a blank sheet of paper and asked himself the question other engineers usually save for the very end, after money was spent and time was lost. What can we eliminate here? He asked himself. It was a provocative question, a revolutionary one. The answer proved equally radical. Practically everything. The standard military aircraft of that era was built on the principle of more is better. Armor everywhere possible. Protection against bullets and shrapnel. Multiple engines. If one fails, The second saves you. Redundant control systems. Full-size landing gear with nose wheel and two main supports, the classic configuration. Weapons, at least machine guns for self-defense. Enormous safety margins, excess load capacity, surplus in everything. Johnson threw this principle in the trash. Armor? Eliminate it. Dead weight. Weapons? Eliminate them. Only slows things down. Second engine? Eliminate it. Every kilogram saved meant either greater altitude or greater range. And altitude was precisely what this whole endeavor was for. The result looks strange even in black and white photographs. The wingspan of U-2 is 24 meters 4 centimeters. That's almost the same as a Boeing 737 passenger jet, which carries 180 people in comfort. Yet the fuselage length is only 15 meters 10 centimeters. A thin arrow with enormous wings on either side. This isn't a fighter, isn't a bomber, a glider with a jet engine. That best captures the essence. The wings aren't accidentally so long. It's not aesthetics or whim. A long wing creates lifting force even in extremely thin air. At 21 kilometers altitude, atmospheric density comprises roughly 7% of what it is at ground level. 7% is almost nothing. Air that doesn't want to hold anything anymore. To fly through this almost nothing, you need enormous wing surface area. But long wings come with a price. On the ground, the wingtips of U-2 droop nearly a meter under their own weight. So flexible and thin, they seem made of tissue paper. This isn't a design flaw, it's a deliberate engineering choice. In flight, that same flexibility allows the wings to bend slightly, damping turbulence and oscillations. The takeoff weight of early versions was around 6,800 kilograms. Most of this weight was fuel, stored in special tanks inside the wings and fuselage. The fuel itself was special, with low vapor pressure, so it wouldn't boil at high altitude where external pressure approaches absolute vacuum. Regular aviation kerosene at 20 kilometers altitude would evaporate right in the tanks, turning into flammable vapor. One engine was selected, Pratt & Whitney J57, specially modified for operating in extremely thin atmosphere. No backup. If the engine failed over Soviet territory, the pilot simply glided downward and hoped for luck. More precisely, he hoped for those very long wings, which provided enough time to do something, attempt some maneuver, try a restart. All of this happened at altitudes where a cabin breach would mean nearly instant loss of consciousness. And here appears a construction detail difficult to take seriously until you see a photograph or video. U-2 has no standard landing gear at all. It's completely absent. Instead of the typical configuration with nose wheel and two main struts, there are two wheels along the fuselage, one forward, one aft, like a bicycle. The aircraft sits on the ground leaning on them, tilting to one wing at roughly a 45-degree angle. Small balancing wheels attached to the very wingtips hold it level, called pogos, from the English pogo stick, referring to a children's spring toy. Before takeoff, a ground crew holds the aircraft by hand, preventing it from tipping completely. As the machine accelerates down the runway and wings begin generating lift, these pogos simply drop onto the concrete. Nobody retrieves them. They lie there off to the side until the aircraft returns hours later, exhausted and full of secret photographs. This wasn't the result of insufficient funds, not the result of rushed schedules. It's a deliberate engineering decision, the price of every kilogram saved. Johnson eliminated absolutely everything unnecessary and produced an aircraft that could climb to altitudes where no one else on the planet could follow. But that same solution created a problem that, during the design phase, apparently received minimal consideration. At 21 kilometers altitude, the atmosphere nearly ceases to function. It doesn't end, it simply becomes useless. Air density there comprises roughly 7% of what you're breathing right now, sitting and reading these words. 7%. A human without protection loses consciousness in 15 seconds. Not gradually, not with warning. The light simply extinguishes. Eyes close, muscles fail, and the person becomes dead weight. 15 seconds. Barely enough time to comprehend what's happening. Everest, the world's highest mountain, reaches 8,848 meters. To reach the altitude where U-2 flew, you'd need to stack 2.5 Everests atop one another. 2.5 mountains. This isn't sky anymore, this is almost space, though far below still exists an enormous planet, populated with billions of people utterly unaware that directly overhead floats a ghost. Commercial airliners today cruise at approximately 10 to 12 kilometers altitude. U-2 flew twice that high. At this altitude, the sky has a completely different color. Not blue, not gray, black. Absolutely black. Like night, like space, like oblivion. The atmosphere is so thin it no longer scatters sunlight the way people on Earth experience it. The blue portion of the spectrum gets scattered by air molecules at ground level, which is why sky appears blue to us. At 21 kilometers, there are too few molecules. Almost none remain. You look upward, an abyss of blackness. You look downward, Earth appears as a sphere, as reality you're about to lose. You literally find yourself suspended between planet and cosmos. You exist between two worlds, and the machine holding you seems desperately, terribly fragile. The pilot sat in a special, hermetically sealed spacesuit, at least in flights after 1956. Initially, the suit was partial, but after a certain incident in 1960, they switched to a full hermetic costume. Picture this. You don a suit that encompasses you completely, like armor. It presses against your body, constrains every movement, prevents normal head rotation. You can't scratch your face. You can't drink water normally, only through a tube. You can't use the bathroom normally. 8 hours, sometimes 10. 8 hours in a cramped cockpit, in a suit suffocating you, in total solitude, absolute solitude. No wingman, no escort, no comrade's voice. Thousands of kilometers of empty sky surrounding you, radiation, cold that penetrates the suit through any gap. But the real danger carried a different name entirely. Pilots called it the coffin among themselves. The official aviation term was critical angle of attack at high altitude. But coffin better captured what was actually happening. Here's how it functioned from a physics perspective. Every aircraft has a minimum flying speed. Below this speed, wings cease generating lift, and the machine begins plummeting. This is called stall. And there's a maximum speed. Beyond this speed, the structure disintegrates under loads. Metal cracks, wings tear off, catastrophe occurs. At lower altitudes, say 5 kilometers where normal aircraft fly, the margin between these two values is enormous. Hundreds of kilometers per hour. A pilot can accelerate, decelerate, maneuver left and right, and remain in a perfectly safe zone. At 21 kilometers altitude, these two values, minimum stall speed and maximum allowable speed, literally meet. They're separated by roughly 15 to 18 kilometers per hour. 15 to 18. This isn't a range, it's a point. Not a spectrum of possibilities, but a needle tip on which hangs all life. For comparison, when you drive on a highway at 120 kilometers per hour, plus or minus 20 kilometers per hour, changes nothing in your existence. You simply drive faster or slower. For a U-2 pilot, those identical 20 kilometers per hour meant the difference between normal flight and total aircraft loss. Slightly slower, the machine begins uncontrollably losing altitude. Wings lose supporting force. The aircraft becomes ballast. Slightly faster, the structure, which Johnson minimized weight on, experiences loads it wasn't designed to withstand. Wings break. Fuselage deforms. Finished. And the pilot must remain in this point for 8, sometimes 10 hours straight. 8 hours. Like a workday. Imagine working, but instead of work, you maintain speed accuracy to 10 kilometers per hour. Without margin for error. Without right to relax an instant. Any turbulence, any unexpected wind gust at this altitude, and the pilot's already beyond the lethal corridor, already fighting the machine, already attempting to return to this razor's edge between life and death. One of the program's earliest pilots, a man named Herr Pletten, described the experience after his first flight like this. I was alone. Absolute silence. Sky above black, like staring into absolute hell. Earth below looks like a toy. And I must maintain this speed. Simply maintain it. This isn't poetic imagery or literary exaggeration. At this altitude, the sky genuinely appears exactly as Pletten described. U-2 pilots were selected more rigorously than astronauts. And not just physical capability, though physicality mattered. They tested psychology, capacity to maintain consciousness and concentration amid complete sensory isolation. The monotony of 8 hours flight, constant nervous system pressure. Most candidates were eliminated during psychological screening. They failed tests because they couldn't handle the idea of being in such a situation. Those who passed screening knew one thing absolutely. The most dangerous moment of flight still lay ahead. Not the takeoff with its acceleration, stress, and separation from ground, not the cruise at altitude with its monotony. The most dangerous moment was landing. U-2 landing was a procedure impossible to describe briefly, and regardless of how you describe it, the description fails. Not because it's technically complex, but because it looks like it was invented by people who'd never actually seen a real airplane. The problem started with those long wings of U-2 that worked so perfectly at 21 kilometers, becoming a nightmare near ground. At ground level, dense air creates something called an air cushion beneath the wings, additional lifting force. The aircraft literally doesn't want to land. It wants to fly again, and with each meter of descent, this impulse strengthens. Aerodynamics works against you. The pilot approaches landing at roughly 170 kilometers per hour. The approach angle is deliberately steep, almost aggressive. If you don't approach steeply, the machine simply slides over the runway without touching down, wasting every drop of fuel. Now add the fact that this aircraft's landing gear is bicycle type. 2 wheels along the fuselage, no lateral support. Stability approximately like a slowly moving bicycle. Seems to balance, but lose a few kilometers per hour speed or bank 5 degrees, and it tips. Zero stability, which is precisely why a vehicle stood alongside the runway. Not for show, not protocol. A second experienced pilot, possessing identical training to the U-2 pilot, took the driver's seat of this vehicle and waited. The moment the descending U-2 appeared at the runway's far end, the vehicle started, accelerated, and began running parallel course, attempting to maintain the aircraft's speed at exactly 170 kilometers per hour along the runway. The driver looked up at the plane's belly and began counting altitude into the radio. 30 feet, 20, 15, 10, 5. His voice sounded calm, but this was the most intense minute of his life. At precisely the right moment, the U-2 pilot did something contradicting absolutely every flying instinct. He deliberately induced a gentle wing stall, suddenly losing lift force. The machine literally dropped the final few meters onto the runway. This wasn't an error. It was the only way to force U-2 to land on the runway rather than another kilometer beyond it in open fields. After wheels touched concrete, began the final phase of the nightmare. The aircraft rolled down the runway on bicycle gear, lacking lateral supports, with enormous wings spanning 24 meters, wanting to drop to Earth under their own weight. And something utterly unbelievable happened. Humans appeared in frame, literally humans. Ground crew technicians stood ready along the runway like judges on a track. The moment U-2 touched Earth, they bolted after it. Special handles were mounted at wingtips. Their task? Grab the wing. Prevent the aircraft from tipping on its side. Hold it until it slowed sufficiently to position the balancing pogos beneath the wingtips again. It looks precisely like attempting to catch a falling 24-meter bicycle hurtling down a runway at over 100 kilometers per hour. And men literally caught it with their hands. While the aircraft decelerated, technicians gripped the wings, prevented them from touching ground, saved the machine from overturning. This wasn't a movie scene. This happened every single time U-2 returned from a mission. Now remember who sits in that cockpit. A human who just spent 8 to 10 hours in complete solitude at 21 kilometers altitude, where the sky is black as oblivion. A human in a costume suffocating him, never releasing. A human who maintains speed accuracy to 10 kilometers per hour throughout this entire period, who just executed one of aviation's most technically demanding approaches, with a voice in his headphones counting altitude. And now, men run behind his aircraft with raised hands, attempting to catch it. U-2 pilots joked that learning to fly the machine wasn't difficult. Difficult was explaining to ground crews what exactly was required of them when they witnessed it firsthand. Difficult was convincing humans they needed to literally catch a falling airplane. Difficult was persuading them this was standard procedure. The machine was ready. Procedures had been drilled hundreds of times in training flights. Engineers understood what they were doing. Pilots understood that they understood. Now remained only one thing: direct this fragile, lethal, incredibly perfect machine toward the objective for which all this existed. July 4th, 1956. Date selection was no accident. American Independence Day. Someone in the Central Intelligence Agency deemed this date symbolic, appropriate for the first flight over Soviet territory. Perhaps it was mockery, perhaps mere coincidence. But U-2 ascended into the air from Weiden Air Base in West Germany early morning, and its route traversed territory officially considered absolutely closed to Western aircraft. Nobody was supposed to pass through. Nobody could pass through. This was a boundary nobody dared cross. The route was meticulously planned. The aircraft flew through Poland, then through Belarus, then deep into Russia, directly over Moscow, over Leningrad, then a turn northwest, through Plesetsk, through Murmansk, toward Norwegian coastline. Several thousand kilometers straight through the center of Soviet land. At 21-kilometer altitude. In Soviet air traffic control centers that day, radar signals appeared immediately, almost from the moment of border crossing. The Soviet air defense system detected an unknown object. This matters to understand. They saw U-2 from the first flight. Always saw. No stealth, no miracle, simply saw, but could do nothing about it. Interceptors launched. MiG-15 and MiG-17, the Soviet Union's finest machines of that era. Soviet interceptor ceiling was roughly 15,500 meters. 5.5 kilometers remained to U-2. 5.5 kilometers, approximately the distance from Earth's surface to ordinary passenger airliner cruising altitude. MiG pilots climbed on afterburner to absolute limits, squeezing every possibility from their engines. Engines began stalling from thin air. Speed dropped. Aircraft lost controllability. Pilots turned downward to their bases, losing this aerial duel. The point above them, invisible, inaudible, unreachable, continued eastward, calmly, confidently, as if no threat existed whatsoever. U-2 cameras during one flight photographed an Earth strip approximately 200 kilometers wide. Lens resolution allowed distinction of objects approximately the size of a large newspaper headline from 21-kilometer altitude. This isn't exaggeration nor marketing hype. These were verified technical specifications of optics specially developed for this program. During the first 2 days of flights, July 4th and 5th, over 25 Soviet cities and military installations were photographed. Aerodromes with aircraft, supply depots, test ranges, railway junctions, strategically vital points. What American intelligence had speculated about for years, constructing theories and hypotheses, now lay on the table as black and white photographs. Irrefutable, impossible to ignore, physical evidence. In total, by 1960, approximately 24 reconnaissance missions had been conducted over Soviet territory. 24 times, U-2 violated Soviet airspace, and not one escaped Soviet detection. Not a single one. This matters most. They knew. The Soviet air defense system saw every flight, heard every sound, tracked every movement, and every time was powerless to do anything. Every time compelled to watch an enemy fly over Soviet soil, photograph Soviet secrets, conduct photographic reconnaissance of the state from altitudes beyond reach. Nikita Khrushchev learned of the flights in that same 1956. Soviet military reported him the clear situation. Aircraft flies. We see it. Cannot reach it. 3 facts, 3 verdicts. Khrushchev issued no official protest against these violations. Not because he didn't want to. He wanted to, surely very much wanted to, but couldn't because politically he couldn't. Official protest would mean public acknowledgement of something utterly unbearable for Soviet leadership. Acknowledgement allowed. Soviet airspace is violated with impunity. No Soviet aircraft can reach it. A nation that 1 year prior launched Earth's first artificial satellite, a nation considering itself technologically superior to the West, capable of defending its own sky against a single American reconnaissance aircraft. Such was politically impossible to acknowledge publicly. Impossible to tell the people, the party, the entire communist world watching the USSR as proletariat vanguard, as technological superiority symbol. Therefore, Soviet official channels fell silent. Silence. Not a word to press. No hint of problem. But in closed Kremlin and Defense Ministry chambers, Frenzied work raged. Urgent development of countermeasures was underway. Soviet designers received an order sounding like possible salvation of state reputation. Create an anti-aircraft missile complex capable of reaching U-2, capable at least at that altitude. Work proceeded several years. Designing such a system, conducting tests, developing combat procedures required practically the remaining portion of the 1950s. By 1960, the complex designated S-75, 75th Anti-Aircraft Missile Complex by Soviet classification, was ready. Not completely, not 100% ready, but sufficiently prepared for combat employment. Several batteries of this complex were deployed at several positions around Sverdlovsk, later renamed Yekaterinburg. Khrushchev waited. He waited not merely for ability to shoot down an aircraft. He waited for a specific moment when everything would align perfectly, so that a captured pilot, captured aircraft, captured proof of American espionage became not merely a military incident. He waited for it to become a political weapon. Weapon of such power that it could alter the entire configuration on the world stage. That moment arrived May 1st, 1960. International Workers' Day, the Soviet Union's primary state holiday. Military parades proceeded through Soviet cities. Columns of people carrying red flags, speeches from tribunes about communism's greatness and Soviet invincibility. Precisely on this day, when all Soviet propaganda power was directed toward demonstrating socialism's advantages, someone in the Central Intelligence Agency decided this was the ideal moment for a particularly crucial reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory. The logic seemed impeccable. On a holiday, Soviet power's attention was concentrated on strength displays, on the parade, on strategic positioning of leaders at tribunes. Nobody would expect an aerial attack. Nobody would be particularly attentive to radars and air defense systems. This was a miscalculation, catastrophic miscalculation that would alter the entire history of U.S.-Soviet confrontation. Francis Gary Powers rose into the air from Bard Air Base in Pakistan at approximately 6:20 in the morning local time. He was an experienced pilot with over 500 hours on U-2. This operation was not his first reconnaissance mission. The route proceeded through Afghanistan, across the Aral Sea, then to Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg. From there northwest, through Plesetsk and Murmansk, toward Norwegian coast. Landing was planned at Bodo Air Base in Norway. Total route length was approximately 6,000 kilometers. Aboard was reconnaissance photographic equipment of latest generation, capable of recording military installations across the Soviet Union's central corridor. Film from a single such flight would provide American intelligence analysts an entire month of intensive work. The first hours of flight proceeded nominally. Powers maintained the designated altitude of 21 kilometers, controlled speed with the precision the machine was capable of, made necessary notations in the flight log. Below stretched boundless Soviet steppe, then dense Ural forests. The machine functioned smoothly, without malfunction. Since takeoff, his blip had been present on Soviet radar screens. The Soviet air defense system saw him, tracked his movement, but could not touch him. He was in its view, but beyond its reach. By the time U-2 penetrated airspace above Sverdlovsk Oblast, deployed S-75 batteries already occupied the region. Several Soviet fighters were scrambled for interception and destruction attempts. Among them was MiG-19 under Senior Lieutenant Igor Mityukov. He performed his duty, attempting to climb as high as possible to meet the American. But even MiG couldn't reach. The altitude difference remained too great. 15.5 versus 21 kilometers. MiG couldn't reach the target. There was no way. Then the anti-aircraft missile crews engaged. At approximately 9 o'clock in local Sverdlovsk time, the first missile launched skyward. Powers felt a sudden, sharp impact from behind. The aircraft shuddered with its entire body, like a living thing receiving a mortal blow. Then came another impact, but weaker. Control systems ceased responding to the pilot's commands. The wings, those very long, flexible structures that held U-2 at 21-kilometer altitude, began disintegrating. The fuselage deformed. The U-2 structure, designed for maximum lightness, didn't account for such loads. The aircraft began uncontrollably falling apart in the air. Powers possessed a self-destruct mechanism, an explosive charge with 70-second delay. According to instructions, If the aircraft was shot down over enemy territory, the pilot was to activate this charge before abandoning the cockpit. Powers didn't do it. Later, he claimed he hadn't had time, that the machine was destroying itself too rapidly, that everything happened too fast. This question would haunt him throughout his life. Was he a coward? Did he act correctly? What else could a human do in such circumstances? Questions without answers, becoming burdens of conscience. Powers exited the cockpit manually, fought against aircraft controls that no longer obeyed, and deployed his parachute. Alive, physically unharmed, he descended over Soviet soil. Across millions of square kilometers of territory, his parachute descended in an area controlled by Soviet armed forces. The probability was astronomical, yet it occurred. Powers landed and was taken into custody almost immediately by local residents. His mission ended, but history was just beginning. Meanwhile, something else occurred. While Powers descended on his parachute into Soviet skies, Soviet anti-aircraft crews continued operations, detecting and destroying air targets in the region. In the same zone where the shot-down U-2 had flown was a Soviet MiG-19 fighter under Captain Sergei Safronov. Safronov was an experienced pilot, knew his machine, was executing command orders to mount interception. He climbed ever higher, attempting to reach the required altitude. Ground control fed him target coordinates. He piloted the machine upward. But in the chaos, in the tension of combat operations, in the rush when action needed to happen fast, someone on the ground made a mistake, a fatal mistake. A Soviet missile, launched by an anti-aircraft battery targeting the American U-2, struck a Soviet aircraft instead. The missile struck MiG-19 piloted by Sergei Safronov, his own aircraft, his own pilot, a combat comrade. In the tumult, when three systems, Soviet interceptors, anti-aircraft batteries, and the American reconnaissance aircraft, occupied the air simultaneously, friendly fire tragedy occurred. Safronov perished. He was 28 years old. And here lies what truly makes this story profoundly bitter. Captain Sergei Safronov's name appeared in no official Soviet account of this incident. His name didn't surface in Soviet newspapers. It didn't sound at the international trial of Powers, broadcast by radio and in newsreels worldwide. His name remained classified. His exploits, his struggle, his death remained invisible, unrecognized, unknown. The Soviet state couldn't acknowledge that a Soviet missile shot down a Soviet aircraft. That would be admitting incompetence, chaos in air defense systems, inadequate preparation. This was never acknowledged. Safronov was buried quietly, in obscurity. His family received official notification that he died fulfilling service duties, but details remained classified. The world knows Francis Powers' story, his flight, his capture, his imprisonment, his trial, his exchange. But the world doesn't know Sergei Safronov's story, the pilot who died not from enemy hands, but from his own side's error. 2 casualties on one day, one known to history, the other erased from it. This is what war conceals. Not glory, not heroism, but mistakes, tragedies, innocent deaths that nobody was supposed to know. Powers landed and was taken into custody by local residents of a Soviet village near the wreckage site. But in Washington, nobody knew this yet. In the Central Intelligence Agency, Powers' fate was unknown initially. When the aircraft failed to radio in and didn't arrive at its planned landing site in Norway, duty officers recorded the aircraft as lost. This had happened before. High-altitude flights over hostile territory represented serious risk. Machines fell, pilots didn't return. It was presumed the machine had been totally destroyed by explosions, that the 70-second delay self-destruct charge had performed its function. The pilot likely hadn't survived. This assumption formed the basis for the entire subsequent information control system. If the pilot perished and the aircraft was destroyed, then no physical evidence existed. Remained only Soviet assertion against American denial, and Soviet word without proof is simply word. Cold War taught both sides to speak beautifully and untruthfully simultaneously. On May 1st in Washington, they began preparing a legend, a version, a story that should explain U-2's disappearance in a way that didn't look like reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. Because officially, the U.S. conducted no reconnaissance flights. Officially. On May 5th, the State Department of the United States issued an official statement. its essence reduced to this. U-2 aircraft belonging to NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was conducting meteorological research over Turkish territory. Weather research. Completely peaceful, completely lawful research. Possibly, the statement claimed, the pilot lost consciousness due to oxygen supply interruption. Perhaps the life support system malfunctioned. The aircraft, losing control, veered uncontrollably off course and violated Soviet borders. An error, an accident, a technical malfunction. NASA also didn't stay on the sidelines of this information operation. The agency provided press with a specially repainted U-2. The aircraft was painted in civilian colors. Civilian NASA identification marks were applied. The aircraft was displayed before photographers and television cameras to confirm the meteorological flight version. See, this is a civilian vehicle. This is research equipment. This isn't a spy. Photographs appeared in newspapers across America and worldwide. The legend began working. People believed, or at least seemed to believe. The legend lasted exactly 2 days. 48 hours of theater, lies, and hope that the Soviet side would stay silent. But the Soviet side had no intention of staying silent. On May 7th, 2 days after the American statement, Nikita Khrushchev took the tribune in the Supreme Soviet. He spoke slowly, clearly savoring every word, every moment of exposure, every second of triumph. This time he laid all his cards on the table, completely, without embellishment. An American aircraft violated the Soviet Union's state border and was destroyed, Khrushchev declared. He named the aircraft U-2. He indicated its flight route. He confirmed the fact of Soviet airspace violation. But Khrushchev didn't stop there. Then he began unfurling his evidence like a magician pulling card after card from his sleeve. Living Francis Gary Powers in photographs. The images show him in good condition, unharmed, alive. Proof that the pilot didn't perish in the crash. Aircraft wreckage with legible serial numbers. Reconnaissance equipment in complete preservation because the explosive charge never detonated. And most importantly, developed films showing Soviet military installations, aerodromes, missile positions. Black and white photographs, crystal clear, powerfully evident, irrefutable. Washington was plunged into shock. They were caught in the act. Not merely caught, humiliated, disgraced on the world stage. They had constructed a beautiful legend about meteorological research, technical failure, innocence, and this entire legend crumbled to dust in one Soviet leader's speech. This wasn't merely an incident, this was political catastrophe. This was a situation of a man caught with somebody else's wallet in his hands, who already 3 times publicly explained that the wallet was his, that he found it on the street, that nobody really understands what's being discussed. Then a witness pulls proof from his pocket. Eisenhower, sitting in the Oval Office, faced one of his presidency's most complex diplomatic situations. He made a decision unprecedented in American politics of that time. He publicly acknowledged the fact of reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory. Acknowledged it personally, officially, without tricks and circumlocution. Eisenhower became the first American president to openly confirm to the world that his nation conducted systematic aerial espionage against another state. Nobody before him had done this so frankly. Before him, American presidents denied, avoided questions, employed diplomatic formulations. But Eisenhower, an old military man, someone accustomed to directness, decided further concealment was impossible. Admission was bitter but unavoidable. The Paris summit, scheduled for May 16th, was supposed to be the first meeting in years of 4 power leaders: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Enormous hopes were placed on this meeting. It was believed that in Paris one could discuss global problems, find common ground, soften confrontation. Diplomats prepared, preliminary agreements were drafted, agenda was established. Khrushchev arrived in Paris. He arrived physically, but refused negotiations spiritually and politically. He appeared before journalists and declared negotiations wouldn't occur until the United States issued official apologies for spy flights. He demanded public contrition. The American side refused. Eisenhower wouldn't apologize. He acknowledged the fact but offered no apologies. This was a matter of pride, national dignity. I acknowledge the fact, but I'm not asking forgiveness. I am President of the United States. The summit closed without ever opening. Leaders of four great powers came to Paris to discuss peace, but dispersed to their homes without exchanging a word. History of diplomacy would call this moment one of Cold War's most symbolic failures. One machine, one pilot, one flight transformed the entire political configuration on the international stage. Khrushchev's exposure destroyed not merely the American legend, it destroyed hope for reconciliation. Now, about a detail usually overlooked by historians, one that reveals the very essence of this story. On Power's person, while he executed his mission, was an object. An ordinary silver coin at first glance. $1, American currency, nothing remarkable. But inside this coin was a hidden cavity. Inside this cavity was a thin needle. The needle was coated with instant-acting poison. The poison was derived from sea mollusks, a toxin that acts within seconds. This wasn't an instrument of war. This was an instrument of death. An instrument for if the pilot found himself in a situation where capture alive was unacceptable. When being taken alive meant torture, interrogation, revelation of all secrets. Powers knew about this coin's existence. He knew it was in his pocket. He knew that at any moment he could take it out, crush it, and the needle would pierce his skin, and poison would finish within seconds what the fall from sky had begun. This was his final freedom, freedom to choose death. They'd given him this coin as a gift, as liberation, as possibility. If you're captured, you can choose the end. No torture, no interrogation, no tears over your body, simply the end. When the aircraft was hit, when control systems failed, when the fuselage began disintegrating, Powers ejected from the cockpit. When he deployed his parachute, when he descended towards Soviet soil, when he saw ground approaching closer and closer, he had the possibility. A black point in the sky, that's what he saw. Earth drawing nearer, death that awaited, and the coin in his pocket, offering choice. But Powers didn't use the poison. He remained alive. He landed alive. He was captured alive. The Central Intelligence Agency constructed its entire cover system on two assumptions. First, the pilot died in the crash. Second, if he survived, he'd use the poison. On these two assumptions rested the entire meteorological research legend. On these assumptions hung the entire system of denial and lies. But Powers destroyed both assumptions. He remained alive. He didn't use poison. He became a prisoner of the Soviet system. August 17, 1960, the Hall of the House of Unions in Moscow. This was a show trial organized by the Soviet state to demonstrate before the entire world the crime of American imperialism. The hall contained hundreds of people, journalists from dozens of countries, television cameras, radio reporters, searchlights directed at the defendant's bench. The Soviet state staged theater, the grandest theater of its time, and ensured the whole world witnessed it. Francis Gary Powers sat in a gray suit. The suit had been specially purchased for the trial. Soviet leadership chose the captive's clothing like a costumer selecting an actor's costume. Gray color. Not threatening, but serious. Simple suit, to show this was an ordinary spy, not a hero, not an influential politician. Simply a man, simply a criminal. On Powers' face was an expression combining exhaustion, fear, and some inexplicable resignation. A man understanding his fate was already decided. Powers admitted his guilt. He admitted flying over Soviet territory. He admitted collecting intelligence information. He admitted violating Soviet airspace. Does a man admit guilt when guilt is obvious, when evidence is laid before the court, when the entire world sees he's guilty? A complex question. Powers admitted. And perhaps this was his resignation. Perhaps it was simply common sense. The verdict was announced. 10 years imprisonment, 3 years in prison, and 7 years in corrective labor camps. By Soviet standards of that time, this was relatively lenient punishment. Not 20 years, not 25, 10. This was a signal. Soviet leadership was leaving itself room for maneuver. It meant Khrushchev was already negotiating exchange, that he was already bargaining with the American side, that powers would be exchanged, but not immediately, not at once. First the trial, first humiliation, first demonstration of power, then exchange. Powers spent approximately 21 months in captivity, nearly 2 years in Soviet prisons and camps. Exchange negotiations proceeded through diplomatic channels, quietly, without public statements. The Soviet side sought to return its man, a Soviet intelligence officer arrested in the United States in 1957. His name was Rudolf Abel. That was his operational name. His real name was William Genrikhovich Fischer, a high-level Soviet intelligence operative. He'd spent several years on U.S. territory undercover, gathering intelligence, working as a double agent. On February 10, 1962, an exchange occurred in Berlin. The location, the Glienicke Bridge, the bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, the bridge running directly along the boundary between two worlds, the boundary between West and East, the boundary between freedom and tyranny, the boundary between life in America and life in the Soviet Union. Across this bridge at its centerline, where Earth below was barely visible, where the Havel River flowed, dark and cold, dividing two worlds, a meeting took place. From the western side walked Francis Gary Powers. From the eastern side walked Rudolf Abel. Two men, two spies, two victims of Cold War. They met at the bridge's center. Each was returning home. Each carried something unspoken. Powers carried captivity trauma, fear of the trial, disbelief he'd actually be released. Abel carried hope he'd be recognized as a hero, that he'd be welcomed as someone who endured captivity, who didn't betray any comrades. Simultaneously with Powers, another captive was released, American student Frederick Pryor, detained in East Berlin on espionage charges. He was exchanged elsewhere, without special publicity, without cameras. But Powers and Abel, their exchange was symbolic, was public, was photographed and documented. Abel returned to Moscow a hero. He was welcomed warmly, with respect, as someone who endured captivity with dignity, who didn't betray anyone. He awaited pension, respect, status as a Soviet intelligence hero. His life back home was assured. Powers returned to the United States, and here begins an entirely different story. The story of a man who returned home and wasn't welcomed as a hero. He was immediately directed to detailed interrogations at the Central Intelligence Agency. Weeks of thorough questioning. Every decision he'd made that day when the aircraft was hit was subjected to microscopic analysis. Why didn't he activate the explosive charge? Why didn't he use the poison needle in the coin? Why did he admit guilt at trial? Why? Why? Questions without satisfying answers, because no answers satisfied anyone. Officially, Powers was exonerated. A special commission under Judge Bork concluded that Powers acted correctly under emergency circumstances. His decisions were logical. His behavior was acceptable. Officially. But unofficially, in CIA corridors, in conversations between agents, in closed offices, coldness remained. Some agency personnel believed he hadn't done enough, that he should have activated the explosive, that he should have used the poison, that he'd betrayed the program by allowing himself to be captured alive. Powers never flew reconnaissance aircraft again. His CIA career was effectively finished. In the 70s, he worked as a test pilot, flew experimental aircraft, risked his life for science. Then he became a helicopter pilot for a television station in Los Angeles. His job was called traffic air monitoring. The man who'd flown alone over Soviet territory at 21 kilometers altitude, who'd parachuted over hostile land, who'd survived Soviet captivity and trial, now told radio listeners about traffic jams on the highway. Attention, there's been an accident on Route 95. Expect 2-hour delay. This was his new life. On July 1st, 1977, his helicopter crashed over Los Angeles. Powers perished. He was 47 years old. Death in a land where he lived but was never recognized. Death in a land that rejected him. Posthumously in 2012, 35 years after his death, Powers was awarded the CIA's Silver Star and a Prisoner of War Medal. Official rehabilitation came 35 years later. But U-2's history didn't end with Powers' exchange or the 1960 scandal. The reconnaissance flight program continued. After the Powers incident, flights over Soviet territory were officially halted. Politically, they became impossible. One downed aircraft could provoke nuclear war. The risk was too great. But U-2 continued flying over other locations: the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. Everywhere where urgent intelligence was needed, everywhere where there was no direct prohibition on flights. And in autumn of 1962, U-2 found itself in the right place at the right moment. October 14th, 1962, early morning. Major Richard Heiser of the United States Air Force rose into the air from Edwards Air Force Base in California and set course for Cuba. The assignment appeared simple visually, but was potentially explosive in content. Photographic reconnaissance of the island's western portion. Intelligence had detected suspicious activity in the region. Construction, equipment transfers. Nothing concrete, simply verification. Photography that should either dispel doubts or confirm fears. Heiser executed the route cleanly, professionally. The cameras did their work. The aircraft returned. Film was taken to the laboratory. When the film was developed and analysts sat at lightboxes, dead silence filled the room. The images showed launching positions for medium-range ballistic missiles, not under construction, not planned, already nearly operational. Soviet R-12 missiles with range of approximately 2,000 kilometers. From Cuba, these missiles could reach Washington, could reach New York, could reach the entire eastern United States. The entire East. Major cities, centers of political and economic power. But analysts saw more than just launching positions. On the images, with crystalline clarity, were visible transport trailers. Trailers with characteristic canvas coverings of a specific shape. Specialists recognized that shape. That's exactly how missile sections were transported. This didn't mean simply construction of launching positions. It meant the missiles themselves were already on the island. Soviet missiles. Soviet nuclear weapons. 90 miles from Florida's coast. All this was visible from 21-kilometer altitude. U-2 cameras captured what people in the Kremlin thought hidden, what the Soviet leader considered a secret, what nobody in Washington expected to see so soon. October 16th, the images landed on President John Kennedy's desk. A young president in office less than 2 years. A president who'd survived the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban invasion that had ended shamefully. Now he received proof that the Soviet threat was directly at America's doorstep. 13 days began. 13 days that historians would later call the most dangerous crisis of the second half of the 20th century. A crisis that came closer to nuclear war than ever before or after. Naval blockade of Cuba, harsh negotiations on closed channels. Soviet ships carrying cargo intended for Cuba receive orders to turn around in the ocean. The entire world watches, holding its breath. What's at stake isn't merely political prestige. What's at stake is the life of millions of people. During these 13 days, U-2 flew over Cuba continuously. Not once, many times. Tracking every change at missile positions. Photographing every new piece of equipment arriving on the island. Recording every indication that the situation was changing. That Soviets were preparing something else. That tension was increasing. U-2 becomes more than merely a reconnaissance aircraft. U-2 becomes the eyes and ears of the president. The intelligence U-2 collected was the intelligence on which Kennedy made decisions that could change world history. Then, October 27th arrived, 14 days after the first flight over Cuba. Major Rudolph Anderson flew on a routine reconnaissance mission over Cuba. An experienced pilot, one of the best in the U-2 program, his aircraft proceeded at cruising altitude in completely normal mode. No danger, no sense that this could be his final flight. The Soviet anti-aircraft missile crew deployed on Cuba opened fire. This decision was made by the local commander, a combat officer on the scene, at a moment when tension reached its peak, when every breath was loud, when every movement could provoke catastrophe. This officer decided to act without requesting Moscow, without sanction from Nikita Khrushchev, without coordinating with higher leadership. He decided that the situation required immediate response. Anderson's aircraft was hit. It didn't return. Rudolph Anderson became the only American military personnel whose aircraft was directly shot down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only one. He was 35 years old. A wife, children, a home in Florida. Everything remained on the ground. He remained in the sky over Cuba. In Washington, in the room where the National Security Council's Executive Committee met, word of Anderson came like thunder from clear sky. Part of the advisors demanded immediate military response. Immediate and harsh. A strike on anti-aircraft missile complex positions on Cuba at minimum. Possibly bombing airfields. Possibly invasion. All cards were already laid out. An invasion plan existed. Troops were ready. The fleet was on combat alert. Everything needed was a presidential order. But John Kennedy chose pause. He chose a moment of reflection. He chose not to respond automatically, not to follow the logic of escalation. He knew that if he'd ordered an attack, if American aircraft had flown to Cuba, to Soviet positions, that would be an act of war. And an act of war against Soviet forces in the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons could lead to nuclear war, to what historians would call World War III, to what would have meant the end of Western civilization, the end of Eastern civilization, the end of everything. October 28th, Nikita Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The crisis formally ended. War didn't occur. The world remained alive. Humanity received a second chance. But it's important to understand why it happened exactly this way. The crisis ended not because everything proceeded according to plan. The crisis ended because several people in several locations on the planet, at several key moments, refrained from immediate action. They thought, they analyzed, they hesitated. And in this deliberation, in this analysis, in this silent confrontation, they found a way out. The film that Heiser made on October 14th gave these people time to see reality, time to think about consequences, time to choose. One aircraft, one pilot, one flight gave the president information allowing him to say no to escalation. One U-2 stood between the world and nuclear war and said, stop. The first such theater was China. After Cuba, U-2 ceased being a delicate instrument reserved for special occasions. It became a workhorse. It was directed wherever high-altitude reconnaissance was needed, without special ceremony, without public announcement, without political debate in the press. From 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency, jointly with the Armed Forces of the Republic of China, Taiwan, launched a program of reconnaissance flights over mainland China. Program name, Black Cats. Officially, the program didn't exist. No documents, no official statements, no acknowledgments toward the Chinese side. The pilots were Taiwanese aviators. They underwent rigorous selection in the United States, received training in American flight schools, received full preparation on U-2. Then they officially resigned from their country's armed forces. This was necessary so their military affiliation couldn't be proven. If they'd been shot down over mainland China, American leadership could deny involvement. This was standard Cold War practice. Use pilots from third countries to conceal the true operations organizers. From 1960 to 1974, the Black Cat Squadron conducted approximately 220 reconnaissance sorties over territory of the People's Republic of China. 220 times, U-2 flew over Chinese soil, gathering intelligence. They photographed nuclear installations, shot military bases, documented strategic infrastructure. The Chinese nuclear program was substantially documented precisely from U-2's cockpit. What Chinese considered deep military secrets, American analysts viewed in high-resolution black and white photographs. But the Soviet Union had by then provided the People's Republic of China anti-aircraft missile complexes called Dvina. These were the same S-75 complexes that shot down France's powers over Sverdlovsk. Dvina, in Soviet designation, S-75 in classification. Now they stood on Chinese soil, deployed at positions ready for combat use. And not merely standing. Soviet designers refined this complex specifically accounting for U-2's characteristics, developing countermeasures, detection methods, ways to achieve kills. 5 Black Cat aircraft were shot down over mainland China. 5 machines, several pilots didn't return. They fell on Chinese soil. Their fate unknown. Their names didn't sound in official chronicles. The program remained classified. Taiwan's government didn't acknowledge their existence. The United States government didn't confirm involvement. Pilots' families received official notification that their loved ones died performing duty, but no details, no reasons, merely fact. This was striking asymmetry. U-2 flew over the Soviet Union for several years with practically no losses. Yes, 1 aircraft was shot down, Powers. But overall, the American program successfully collected intelligence over Soviet territory. Over China, the picture was entirely different. Beginning when Soviet complexes appeared at positions, losses commenced. The asymmetry explained itself simply. Soviet designers refined the Dvina complex, specifically accounting for U-2's characteristics, considering experience dealing with this aircraft over the USSR. When China received this missile, it received an improved version, adapted to this specific threat. Parallel with the China program ran an entirely different theater, Vietnam. From 1964, U-2 regularly flew over Southeast Asia. Here, the task was completely different. Not strategic reconnaissance of installations, not intelligence gathering about nuclear weapons or missiles. Tactical observation, tracking troop movements, documenting equipment moving along roads and trails. Reconnaissance was conducted along the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a branching network of roads and paths traversing Laos and Cambodia, along which flowed continuous supply from north to south. Along these trails moved trucks, motorcycles, men carrying ammunition, food, fuel to fronts in South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the lifeblood artery of North Vietnamese army. During one sortie over Vietnam, a pilot captured film of an equipment column, a column stretching for 80 kilometers and more. 80 kilometers! That's like distance from one city to another. 80 kilometers of one flowing stream of equipment, troops, ammunition, trucks, tanks, armored personnel carriers, men on foot. All this was in one column, moving in one direction, northeast. Data from this sortie was deciphered and delivered to command literally within 4 hours of landing. 4 hours. By standards of that time, this was an incredible result. Usually, reconnaissance data became known days or weeks later. Here it was hours. Information processing speed became a weapon. U-2 wasn't merely collecting intelligence, it was collecting it with such speed that command received operational information, intelligence usable for making combat decisions here and now. But by the late 1960s, it became clear the base U-2 design, created in 1954, was exhausting its modernization resources. New reconnaissance systems required increasingly more space aboard. New equipment was bulkier, heavier, required more power, demanded better aircraft integration. The fuselage, whose structure was completed 15 years prior, physically couldn't accommodate all this equipment. Its volume was exhausted. Its safety margin, designed by Johnson for specific loads, was already consumed. The machine that was a marvel in the 50s was beginning to become a bottleneck in the 60s. It could fly, but it couldn't house the new equipment necessary to maintain reconnaissance effectiveness level. In 1968, the U-2R version entered service. This was essentially not merely an upgrade, it was an almost entirely new aircraft built on an old foundation. Wingspan grew from 24 meters 4 centimeters to 31 meters 400 centimeters. That's 7 meters more. Fuselage length grew from 15 meters 10 centimeters to 19 meters 20 centimeters. That's 4 meters more. The new Pratt & Whitney J75 engine provided greater thrust at cruising altitude, allowing the aircraft to climb even higher, fly even longer. Useful payload increased many times over. The machine could carry more equipment, more fuel, more capabilities. But the principle remained unchanged. Long wings, one engine, bicycle landing gear, one pilot in hermetic spacesuit, maximum altitude. The machine's essence didn't change. Johnson, developing U-2 in the 1950s, designed it so precisely for its niche that the safety margin he incorporated revealed itself over decades. New components integrated into old philosophy. New avionics worked with existing structure. Modernization affected details, not essence. The machine remained Johnson's machine, simply a more powerful and functional version. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world changed fundamentally. Formally, the primary reason U-2 was created at all had vanished. The Iron Curtain fell. The confrontation between two systems, which had defined every decision since 1947, since the beginning of the Cold War, ended. U-2 should have retired, should have gone to a museum, should have become an exhibit, a monument to a past era. It didn't. In 1990, when the Soviet Union still hadn't fully collapsed, when the Cold War was already ending but still continued, U-2 flew over Iraq. After the Persian Gulf War, it tracked troop movements, military infrastructure condition, Iraqi leadership intentions. Conflicts changed form, wars took new faces, but U-2 remained necessary. In 2001, already in the new century, U-2 went to Afghanistan. War against terror. War against extremism. Completely different enemy. completely different type of conflict. But U-2 flew, photographed, gathered intelligence. In 2003, U-2 returned over Iraq. New war, completely different circumstances, completely different objectives. But the machine remained needed. Then Syria, the Korean Peninsula, surveillance of the situation around Ukraine from U-2's cockpit, flying in international airspace. The world was changing with enormous speed. Conflicts changed form and content. Enemies that couldn't be predicted. Threats nobody expected. But throughout all this, U-2 adapted. A machine designed for the Cold War found application in new wars. A machine that seemed anachronistic proved invaluable. This is because U-2 isn't merely an old machine. It's a machine that survived one era, survived the transformation of an entire world, and remained useful in completely new circumstances. This is because Johnson, designing it, wasn't thinking about one specific enemy, one specific type of war, one specific historical moment. He thought about principles, how to achieve maximum altitude with minimum means, how to gather information while flying higher than enemies could reach. These principles proved universal. They worked against the USSR. They worked over Cuba. They worked over Iraq. They worked over Afghanistan. They work still. U-2's history is the history of a living machine, not an exhibit in a museum, not a monument to the past, but a living instrument continuing to perform its work. A machine that witnessed the Cold War and became its symbol. A machine that witnessed the Cold War's end and continued flying. A machine that witnessed walls falling, a new world being born, wars against terrorism, conflicts in Asia, tensions at borders, and everywhere U-2 was needed. Everywhere its services proved useful. Everywhere this fragile, almost fantastical machine found its place in a world changing faster and becoming more unpredictable. Living history. History that hasn't ended. History of a machine 70 years old that still flies, still gathers intelligence, still remains necessary. History of how engineering genius, safety margin designed for decades, allowed a machine to survive its era and find application in new eras. History of how simple principles, altitude, speed, maneuverability, proved eternal, timeless, universal. A machine impossible to abandon because there's nothing to replace it with. A machine that should have retired but continues working. As of 2024, the United States Air Force operates approximately 27 U-2S aircraft, a small fleet. 27 machines for the entire world, 27 eyes looking from 21-kilometer altitude. Primary base, Beale Air Force Base in California. Cruising altitude, up to 21 kilometers. Speed, approximately 800 kilometers per hour. Crew, one pilot, in a spacesuit. Everything as in 1955. Everything as immediately after creation. 3 times the Air Force officially raised the question of decommissioning the U-2 program. In 2006, in 2012, in 2015. 3 times they said, "This machine is archaic, it's old, we need to get rid of it." 3 times Congress of the United States blocked this decision. Not from sentimentality, not because Washington contains people who love history. The reason was prosaic and ruthless. There was no replacement. Unmanned aircraft like Global Hawk couldn't fly as high. Satellites didn't provide the same flexibility in choosing routes and flight times. SR-71 Blackbird, which was supposed to replace U-2 many years ago, was decommissioned in 1998. SR-71 flew at 3.2 times the speed of sound, meaning at 3,529 kilometers per hour. It was faster than any weapon of that time, but it was too expensive to operate. Its fuel was exotic. Its systems were complex. And most importantly, it wasn't flexible. It flew fast and briefly. It couldn't hover over a target, couldn't maneuver, couldn't patiently gather intelligence for hours. When SR-71 was decommissioned, nothing replaced it. U-2 remained. Global Hawk is a modern unmanned aircraft. Its wingspan is 39 meters 90 centimeters, exceeding that of a Boeing 737 passenger jet. It can remain airborne for over 32 hours without refueling. 32 hours. That's about a day and a half. Incredible endurance. It operates without a pilot in a spacesuit, without constraints related to human physiology. cost of one Global Hawk was estimated at approximately $220 million. In 2011, it was officially announced. Global Hawk will replace U-2. The U-2 program will close. This seemed logical, appeared logical. An unmanned aircraft, more safe, no pilot losses, newest avionics, all modern sensors and systems. Global Hawk, that very Global Hawk that flies worldwide, gathering intelligence for NATO and American forces. However, 3 years passed. In 2014, this decision was reversed. It turned out that Global Hawk's practical ceiling is approximately 18,000 meters. U-2 flies to 21 kilometers, that is 21,000 meters. 3 kilometers difference. On paper, this doesn't look like catastrophe. 3 kilometers in the sky. What does that mean? But in reality, 3 kilometers of altitude means difference in sensor coverage zone. 3 kilometers means difference in protection from modern anti-aircraft missile complexes. 3 kilometers means difference in quality of obtained photographs using the same optics. Moreover, operating costs per flight hour for U-2 turned out to be significantly lower than Global Hawk for similar tasks. The Air Force spent years planning replacement. They conducted all necessary calculations. They compared characteristics, and ultimately, they reached a conclusion that sounds like mockery of modernity. They maintained in service an aircraft developed in 1954 because no modern apparatus could perform its functions better. This is a paradox of perfection. This is a paradox of genius. Clarence Johnson designed U-2 so precisely for his niche that this niche remains unfilled to this day. Nobody else has managed to create a machine better than U-2 for its tasks. SR-71 solved the problem through speed. Transit as quickly as possible over the territory, gather information, and depart. This worked for certain purposes, but not all. Global Hawk solves the problem through endurance. Long presence in the air without need for refueling. This works when you need to monitor vast territory for extended time. U-2 solves the problem through altitude and unique combination of capabilities. Altitude, 21 kilometers. Speed, sufficient for mission execution. Flexibility, ability to maneuver, change route, hover over target. Endurance, sufficient for complex missions. And all this in one package. Nobody has managed to reproduce this combination. Nobody has created a machine that is both so high altitude and so flexible and so economical simultaneously. A machine from the 1950s remains the best machine for its task in the 21st century. This sounds like impossibility, like a joke of history, like mockery of progress. But it's reality. U-2 remains in service because there are no alternatives, not because U-2 is good. U-2 truly is good, but primarily because nothing better has been created. Nearly 70 years have passed. Technology has advanced incredibly far. Computers have become millions of times more powerful. Materials have revolutionized. Aerodynamics reached heights Johnson could only dream of. And despite all this, despite all achievements, despite all humanity's intelligence, nobody has managed to create a machine better than U-2 for work at 21-kilometer altitude. Clarence Johnson passed away in December 1990. This was a moment of historical coincidence, too symbolic to be random. Several months before, the Berlin Wall fell. Several months after his death, the Soviet Union collapsed, the nation he'd been observing since 1954. Johnson lived long enough to see his creation survive the confrontation that spawned it, survive scandals that nearly led to its destruction, survive multiple official decisions to retire it. Everyone involved with U-2 paid a price. Johnson dedicated 8 months of intensely strenuous work to the project, then decades of refinement and modernization. He watched his machine change, evolve, yet retain its essence. Power spent nearly 2 years in Soviet captivity, endured years of cold reception in his homeland, lost reputation he never recovered during his lifetime. Rudolf Anderson never returned from a flight over Cuba in October 1962. Black Cat pilots conducted flights over China without possibility of official recognition, and several never returned. Each of them gave this aircraft something real, and the aircraft continued flying regardless, continued flying through all scandals, all wars, all political games. That's what legend means in its truest sense. It's not a grand name, it's not an exhibit in a museum under a plaque, it's not a monument of marble and bronze. Legend is when a thing outlives everyone who created it, used it, and tried to replace it, yet remains needed, remains necessary, remains working. At the very beginning of this story, I called U-2 a dragon. A dragon isn't tamed in the full sense. A dragon isn't a household pet. The most experienced pilots in the U-2 program spoke of this aircraft exactly this way. The machine tolerates you while you're good enough. Lose concentration, make a mistake of only 15 kilometers per hour with speed, and it will cast you off without warning, without second chance. A dragon demands perfection. A dragon doesn't tolerate mistakes. A dragon doesn't forgive weakness. Look at everything happening around this aircraft over 7 decades. Scandals on the international stage, diplomatic crises, politicians lying to the entire world, military officers making decisions without higher authority, intelligence agents never vindicated during their lives. The dragon isn't guilty of any of this. It simply flew where directed, flew at altitudes it was capable of, took photographs, returned or didn't return. U-2 aircraft over entire operational history have been lost in quantities of approximately 25 units for various reasons. Accidents, combat losses, technical failures. That's significant for a machine with such flight hours and such missions. But those that remained continue flying. Right now, this very moment, while you hear these words, a U-2 is somewhere in the air. Not in a museum, not on a static display. In the air, at 21-kilometer altitude, where sky is black, like death, like space, like abyss, where Earth appears like a map in geography class. One pilot in a hermetic spacesuit sits in a narrow cockpit, maintaining speed in a corridor 15 kilometers per hour wide. That's his job. That's his task. That's what he's here for. Cameras operate, data records, photographs are taken. Nobody knows exactly what U-2 is flying over in this moment. Nobody knows what secrets it's recording. Nobody knows what decisions will be made based on these photographs. It's designed that way. Part of the system: public ignorance, operational secrecy, intelligence classification. 70 years ago, a man with a blank sheet of paper asked himself a question. Not, how do we do this? Not, where do we get resources? Not, who can help? Simply, what can we eliminate here? He answered that question radically. Eliminated armor, eliminated weapons, eliminated the second engine, eliminated everything unnecessary, everything not absolutely vital. Eliminated so much that he created a machine from which you now cannot eliminate anything. Paradox of history, irony of time. A question about what to eliminate leads to creation of something impossible to eliminate, because there's nothing to replace it with, because nobody created better, because perfection, once achieved, is impossible to surpass. U-2 flies, right now. Somewhere over the world, at the edge of the atmosphere, between planet and space. One pilot in a costume that suffocates. One machine that tolerates only perfection. One story that never ends. One legend that lives, right now. Somewhere over the world, at the edge of the atmosphere, between planet and cosmos. One pilot in a suit that suffocates. One machine that tolerates only perfection. One story that never ends. One legend that lives. But here's a question nobody dares ask aloud. How many secrets does U-2 still keep? Which photographs were never declassified? Which missions remain in archives that won't open for 100 years? Because intelligence history is the story of what people aren't supposed to see, what the world isn't ready to know, what governments are prepared to hide forever. And what do you think? What's hidden in those archives? Do you believe U-2 still flies over the same things it flew over 70 years ago? Over secrets the world will never know? Or is there another version? Write in the comments. Share your theory, because this is not textbook history. This is a story of questions without answers. If you want to know the truth, like this video. If you're interested in stories governments would rather forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you're first to access materials officially considered forgotten, but continue living in the archives. U-2's story isn't finished. It's flying right now, upward into black sky, to where no one can follow, somewhere out there in the void between stars.